Today, you could lose your house. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics for our latest post covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian flavour. Well, the migration towards the digital transfer of property is well and truly underway. But there are also some cautionary tales that are worth understanding. This is one from the UK, which has recently emerged. The Reverend Michael Hall was contacted by neighbours after the new owner began building work on his Luton property. A BBC investigation found Mr. Hall's identity had been stolen and used to sell the house, taking the proceeds for himself. Mr. Hall was working in North Wales when he received a call from his neighbours in late August, who said that someone was in the house and all the lights were on. When he returned home the following day, he found a new owner living in the terraced house and all his possessions gone. Police had initially dismissed Mr. Hall's concerns, saying that the issue was a civil matter. Mr. Hall told BBC Radio 4's You and Yours, "I went to the front door, tried my key in the front door, it didn't work, and a man opened the front door to me. I pushed him to one side and got into the property. I really didn't know what he was doing there." The shock of seeing the house completely stripped of furniture, all furnishings, carpet, curtains, everything was out of the property. The man said he was doing building work, to which Mr. Hall replied, "I haven't sold the house, it's still my property." The builder left and returned with the new owner's father while Mr. Hall contacted the police. The man who said he'd bought the terraced house in July said, "It is now my property. You are now trespassing. Get out." Mr. Hall said, "We then tried to access the land registry documentation online to find out whose name appeared, and it was in fact, of course, as of the 4th of August, this man's name." Mr. Hall continued, "At that point the police said, 'Well, there's nothing further we can do here. This is a civil matter. You need to leave the house and contact your solicitors.'" He received the same response when he contacted the police online. "I was shocked, having seen the house in the state it was. I was in a bit of a state of shock anyway, but then to be told by the police they didn't believe a criminal offence had been committed here was just unbelievable," he said. Bedfordshire Police Fraud Squad have now begun an investigation, and there have so far been no arrests. As part of their investigation, the BBC obtained the driving licence which was used to impersonate Mr. Hall and details of a bank account set up in his name. And they also obtained phone recordings of the fraudulent transactions involved in selling the house. Once the house was sold to the new owner, they legally owned it, even if it was sold by somebody impersonating Mr. Hall. According to the BBC, the solicitors involved in the property transaction said there was an ongoing police investigation and that it was inappropriate to comment further. "We will continue to cooperate with the police and comply with our professional obligations," the firm said. In fact, the Land Registry paid out a total of £3.5 million in compensation for fraud last year. A spokesperson for the Land Registry said, "We work with professional conveyancers such as solicitors and rely on them and the checks that they make to spot fraudulent attempts to impersonate property owners. Despite our efforts, every year we do register a very small number of fraudulent transactions." And they added, "There are steps owners can take to protect their properties against fraud, such as signing up for the HM Land Registry's free property alert service, which helps owners to detect any potential property fraud and make sure their property is registered with extra restrictions to make identity theft more difficult." Now, back in 2017, the FT also covered this same issue, saying, "Picture this. If you were driving down the street with a friend and you point out a rental house you own which is currently let to a nice young family, except that instead of signs of family life, you see that your house is empty and a large for sale sign has been placed in its front garden. It turns out that your tenants are in fact ruthless fraudsters who have stolen your identity and put your house on the market." So-called property hijacking, where fraudsters pose as legitimate owners of a property and sell it on without the real owner's knowledge, is a growth industry for criminals in the UK. Figures from the Land Registry, the official register of property ownership in England and Wales, show that the value of the fraud has more than tripled since 2013, when it was £7.2 million, hitting £24.9 million in the year to April 2017. Regulators and the police are ramping up their advice to owners on how to avoid falling victim to the crime. Alistair Lewis, Director of Legal Services at the Land Registry, says property is a high-value asset and therefore an attractive target for fraudsters. Your property, even your family home, can be sold and mortgaged to raise money without you even knowing. Fixing the mess can be distressing, time-consuming and costly. Land Registry has a counter-fraud unit which works closely with the police and other agencies to reduce the risk of property fraud, he says. Since September 2009, it's prevented frauds on 254 applications representing properties valued in excess of £117 million. Home hijacking takes place when fraudsters steal a property, most commonly by assuming the homeowner's identity and selling or mortgaging the property without their knowledge. Then they disappear with the money, leaving the true owner to deal with the consequences. The most common form of the scam works like this. Criminals pay people to pose as tenants and rent a property using fake identities. Then one person changes their name by deed poll to match the owner's name and puts the property on the market and sells it to a cash buyer. It's only when the buyer goes to register the change of ownership with the land registry that the true owner, the landlord, is alerted. Although the owner faces a protracted legal headache, they will get their house back, but the cash buyers will rarely see their money again. In a legitimate sale, there are usually a few weeks between exchange and completion, giving solicitors on both sides of the sale time to assure themselves that both the buyers and sellers are who they say they are and everything is above board. But the fraudsters in a property scam do their utmost to rush a sale through, putting pressure on the buyer to complete quickly and leaving less time for someone to uncover the scam. Investigating the title of the property is one of the most important elements of conveyancing, but solicitors say this fraud can be difficult to spot because the perpetrators change their names by deed poll to match the real owner's name. One owner who fell victim to the scam was Penny Hastings, the wife of journalist and historian Sir Max Hastings, who found a £1.3 million rental property had been sold by the tenant without her knowledge. In this case, the Land Registry picked up the attempted fraud before the West London home's ownership deeds were transferred. But while Ms Hastings did not lose her property, the Land Registry did not allow the transaction to go through. The duped buyer had lost the £1.3 million she paid for it. Land Registry said it detected 50 similar attempts to change the register fraudulently in the past financial year, compared to the 32 cases it uncovered in 2013. Home hijacking has been fueled by a broader growth in identity theft. CFAS, which monitors financial fraud, says the number of identity fraud cases hit a record high in 2016, accounting for more than half of all fraud. The hijacking scam is not the only form of property fraud on the rise. The detected number of bogus conveyancer scams has gone up by 350 incidents in 2012 to more than 700 last year, according to the Solicitors Regulatory Authority. Beth Holden, property litigation expert at Anthony Gold Solicitors, says property fraud has been rising over the past 3 years, from bogus sellers gaining access to tenants, to misleading investment schemes, to the hackers intercepting money. Criminals are getting very inventive in the ways they attack unsuspecting buyers and sellers, she said. The SRA this month updated its risk advice to property lawyers, warning specifically about Friday afternoon fraud. In this variant, criminals intercept the large money transfers involved in a property sale on a Friday afternoon, knowing that the theft is unlikely to be detected until the following week. They exploit techniques such as hacking, phishing, and confidence trickery to convince unwitting conveyancers to send clients' money to the wrong bank accounts. Law firms are targeted by criminals because they hold sensitive information and large amounts of money, the SRA warned. They can be a target for cyber crime and other scams, such as Friday afternoon fraud, or being tricked into dealing with a bogus law firm. According to the SRA, almost a quarter, or 22%, of solicitor firms have reported being approached by scammers. At large firms, this rises to 44%. Ms Holden, who represents victims of property fraud, last year acted for a home buyer who paid £470,000 for a property only to find the seller did not really own it. She says that in such cases it can be impossible to recover the lost money from the fraudsters, as they are either untraceable or based abroad. But she says that if the conveyancing firm has failed to protect the transaction from the risk of fraud, they can be found liable. In the case she cited, the court determined that both conveyancers, the buyers and the sellers were jointly liable for the fraud victim's loss. And she added, more recently, however, the law has tended towards blaming the buyer's solicitor for any failure to spot a fraud. This seems to reassert the old buyer beware doctrine, where purchasers have to be extra diligent. All property purchasers need to heed the list of warning signs published by the Law Society and the Land Registry and resist the pressure for an uncomfortably quick completion. David Smith, Policy Director at the Residential Landlords Association, says part of the problem lies in the fact that there is a huge amount of pressure on conveyancing solicitors to complete sales quickly. If fraudsters have a forged passport, which is very easy to get online these days, it can be difficult to establish whether someone is really who they say they are, Mr. Smith said. But if a property is unmortgaged, vacant at the time of possession, of high value, and the seller is living abroad and wants a speedy completion, these are all red flags and should require due diligence. Detective Constable Richard Kirk of the Metropolitan Police says all parties in the sale should be on the lookout for warning signs. If a seller is insisting on the immediate sale, then scrutinise their justification for that, says Mr. Kirk. Face-to-face meetings are key to uncovering a potential property fraud, as is background checks. Currently, the fraud is only being detected when the money has gone, but there are ways in which potential cases can be nipped in the bud, he said. If tenants are hassling the agents, saying they need the keys and want to move in quickly, and then a simple check that owners or agents can carry out is to go around with a bunch of flowers a few days after the tenant has got the keys, Mr. Kirk said. If you see that the property is still empty, then take that as a warning sign. Fraudulent tenants rarely actually move into the house they're looking to sell on quickly. When it comes to the scammers who impersonate the owners, Mr. Kirk suggests solicitors look out for people using brand new passports. Fraudsters change their names by deed poll to the landlord's name and then try to sell the properties within a few weeks of doing so. If you're presented with a new passport, ask to see the person's old passport, Mr. Kirk said. Also, following up on references, don't just phone the number given to you. Do some investigation yourself and make sure you have the rightful owner. Those most at risk of this type of fraud are owners with empty properties or those with rented properties. Other easy targets are houses with no mortgage against them, those not registered with Land Registry, and properties owned by people living abroad. The chances of falling victim to property fraud may remain relatively low, but for those who are unlucky enough to experience it, the impact can be emotionally harrowing and financially costly. Homeowners concerned about fraudsters selling their home or taking out loans against the property can sign up for a free alert service offered by Land Registry. Owners will receive an email message when there is certain activity related to their property, such as an application to change the ownership details. They can then decide whether they think the activity is suspicious and can notify the Land Registry, their lender, and the police. More than 60,000 people have so far signed up to the service, which is free to any landlord with an active email address and knowledge of the full address or title number of the property to be monitored. Up to 10 properties in England and Wales can be monitored on one account, and there is no requirement that the person monitoring the property actually owns it, so owners can keep an eye on homes owned by elderly family members or people living overseas. Alistair Lewis, Land Registry Director of Legal Services, said property owners should make sure their contact details are up to date so the Land Registry can reach them easily. This is important for people not living in their property, such as landlords. Property owners can have up to 3 addresses on the register, including an email address or an address abroad. And owners who feel their property might be at risk can take a further step, entering a restriction on the property. This will freeze the processes of a transfer or mortgage unless a conveyancer or solicitor confirms the application was made by the rightful owner. So coming back to Australia, what's the situation here? Well, here in Australia, there isn't a similar service that I can find where you can just register and get alerted, but you can put a restriction on your property, so it might be worth talking to your solicitor or lawyer if that's something that you might want to do. I'd also make the point, though, that the issue of fraudulent transfer is ultimately down to the entire value chain, including whether lawyers and solicitors do the work appropriately and whether they take due care. And if you are a landlord with a property, it's worth making sure that you understand some of the risks here, because it seems to me that certainly in Australia, the greater risks are related to tenancy structures. So in summary, this is something to keep an eye on. And I suspect with the fully digital registration that we now have, we'll be hearing more about fraudulent transfers ahead. Now, if you're buying your home in Sydney's contentious market, you don't need to stand alone. This is the time you need to have Edwin Almeida from Ribbon Property Consultants standing alongside you. Buying a property is both challenging and adversarial. The vendor has a professional on their side. Emotions run high, price discovery and price transparency are hard to find, and then there's the wasted time and financial investments that you make. Edwin understands your needs, so why not engage a licensed professional to stand alongside you? With RPC, you know you have experience, knowledge, and master negotiators looking after your best interests. So shoot Ribbon an email at info@ribbonproperty.com.au, and if you use the promo code DFAWTW/Martin, you can get a 10% discount offer. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.